Ich bin ein Berliner.
America first. America first.
NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now.
This morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum.
Am I going to impose tariffs on the European Union? You want the truthful answer, or should I give you a political answer?
The end of the West. Is it upon us? A turning point so profound that the very bedrock of global security is questioned. The unthinkable is unfolding. A seismic shift is shaking the very foundation of the Western world. For over 70 years, the United States stood as Europe's unshakable protector, a leader in democracy and the free world. But now, the question arises, is the West falling apart? Is the era of American dominance over? As the world watches, the age-old alliance between Europe and the United States stands on the brink of a dramatic shift. But what does the future hold, and how did we get here? Welcome to the Knowledge Compass. In this first episode of The Fall of West, we dive into the shifting tides of global power and what's at stake for the future of the West. Let's rewind the clock back to a time when the world was divided. It was the height of the Cold War, and Europe was still reeling from the destruction of World War II. But from the ashes, the United States emerged as the globe's undisputed leader, offering not just military might, but the promise of a brighter, democratic future. For over 70 years, the United States has been Europe's unwavering partner, both a defender and a beacon of hope during the Cold War. Under the leadership of figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry Truman, the US helped Europe rebuild after World War II. The Marshall Plan, signed into a law in 1948, provided over $13 billion to help Europe recover, revitalizing the economies of Western nations and ensuring stability. In 1947, with the shadow of Soviet expansion threatening Europe, the United States responded with something revolutionary, the Marshall Plan. This wasn't just a financial aid, it was a bold move to prevent the Soviet domino effect. The idea was simple: rebuild Europe, protect democracy, and in doing so, safeguard the American way of life. This marked the beginning of an era in which the United States and Europe stood united, forging what became known as the Transatlantic Alliance. Under the leadership of presidents like Truman and Roosevelt, America embraced its role as a leader of the free world. NATO was formed as a symbol of collective defense, a united front against the Soviet Union. For decades, Europe could rest easy knowing that the US was standing guard, its military might and ideological strength guiding the Western world through the perils of the Cold War. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of U.S.-European unity came in 1963 when President John F. Kennedy visited Western Berlin. Standing before thousands of Berliners, he declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." These words were not just greeting, they were a declaration of solidarity in the face of Soviet aggression.
As a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
For decades, this unity stood strong. Under Reagan, America's resolve was further cemented when he called out the Soviet Union at the Berlin Wall in 1987, urging Mr. Gorbachev to tear down this wall. This was a powerful statement against tyranny and a defining moment in the Cold War that would ultimately see the collapse of the Soviet Union. 1989, the Berlin Wall falls and Soviet Union collapses. This moment didn't just mark the end of a wall, it signified the triumph of the ideals America championed: democracy, freedom, and the sovereignty of the nations. The United States had led the charge against Soviet oppression, and Europe was forever changed. But in the shadow of victory, a new question began to emerge. What happens when that beacon of hope dims? But with every rise, there is always the inevitable fall. And as we march through time, we will see how the seeds of doubt about US leadership were sown, leading us to today. Our story doesn't start in the present, but in 1823, when the Monroe Doctrine marked America's first declaration of a single approach to global power, policy of isolationism, one that would define America's early stance in international relations. The Monroe Doctrine drew a line in the sand, telling Europe, this hemisphere is ours, stay out. In many ways, the rise of Donald Trump's America First agenda in 2017 echoes the very point of Monroe Doctrine, and America turning inward, focusing on its own interests over global alliances. Trump's policies, from withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement to questioning NATO's relevance, began to unravel decades of diplomacy and international cooperation. In 2017, the world saw a stark shift in American foreign policy. Trump's criticism of NATO and the US international commitments began to fracture the unity built in the aftermath of World War II. For the first time since the Cold War, NATO found itself questioned by the very nation that had founded it.
These grave security concerns are the same reason that I have been very, very direct with Secretary Stoltenberg and members of the alliance in saying that NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States. And many of these nations owe massive amounts of money from past years and not paying in those past years. Over the last 8 years, the United States spent more on defense than all other NATO countries combined. If all NATO members had spent just 2% of their GDP on defense last year, we would have had another $119 billion for our collective defense and for the financing of additional NATO reserves.
Since the end of World War II, the US had become the cornerstone of post-war international order, with NATO at its heart. For much of the Cold War, Europe was able to rely on United States military might and diplomatic influence, creating a balance of power that would be crucial in keeping the peace across the Atlantic. From the very beginning of his presidency, Donald Trump's America First mantra signaled the start of a new chapter in US foreign policy, one that focused on unilateralism, transactional diplomacy, and self-interest. The withdrawal from Paris Climate Agreement was a stark declaration. The US was no longer bound by global commitments.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. From this day forward, A new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. America first.
In 2018, Trump openly questioned NATO, demanding the European nations increase their defense spending, accusing them of freeloading of U.S. resources. His words hit hard in Brussels. Why should we protect Europe when others aren't pulling their weight? Trump's challenge to NATO wasn't just a political disagreement, it struck at the very foundation of Western security. In 2020, a critical shift occurred in global perception of the United States. Once regarded as the leading superpower, the US saw a significant decline in favorability from major Western allies and beyond. Countries like UK, France, and Germany all saw a dramatic dip in approval ratings for the United States during the Trump administration, as many questioned America's role in the world stage and the future of its leadership. The drop in favorability in 2020 marked a pivotal moment in the US relationship with Europe and other key global players. This decline set the stage for the political and diplomatic challenges that followed as America's global reputation entered a period of uncertainty. After the re-election of President Donald Trump in February 2025, the diplomatic world watched in shock as the relationship between United States and Ukraine hit a dramatic turning point. Inside the Oval Office, President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky engaged in an explosive confrontation that not only escalated tensions between the two leaders but also set off a series of events with far-reaching consequences for the Transatlantic alliance.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. You're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country.
During the meeting, Trump and his deputy, Vice President J.D. Vance, accused Zelensky of not showing enough gratitude for U.S. support. The two leaders laid out an ultimatum. You are either going to make a deal or we are out. Trump's words were a clear warning to Ukraine. If no peace agreement with Russia was reached soon, the United States would withdraw its support. What followed was a suspension of more than $1 billion in military aid to Ukraine, sending shockwaves to the international community. The implications of these decisions are profound, not just for the Ukraine, but for the broader European security architecture. The United States, once a dominant figure in NATO and a stalwart defender of Europe, is now pulling back from its commitments. This pause in military aid disrupts Ukraine's access to critical defensive systems like air defense missiles, long-range artillery, and intelligence support, all of which are key to Ukraine's defense against Russia's ongoing aggression. As Europe watches the deterioration of US-Ukraine relations, question arises about the future of the West itself. If the United States retreats from its global commitments, can Europe continue to rely on its American ally? With the US administration signaling an America-first approach, Europe finds itself at crossroads, grappling with the idea of military independence and a redefined security strategy. The US shift is a clear signal to Europe that they can no longer count on Washington to defend them from external threats, especially with the ongoing war in Ukraine. Europe may have to rely on itself or build new alliances if it wants to secure its borders and ensure its security. This new era of uncertainty has been compounded by Europe's dependence on the United States for advanced military technology and intelligence. Without continued US support, European nations will face a critical challenge in maintaining their defense capabilities. While European countries are stepping up their contributions to Ukraine's war efforts, their stockpiles cannot fully replace what the United States provides in terms of advanced weaponry and logistical support. For Ukraine, Ukraine, the suspension of US military aid is a devastating blow. Ukrainian President Zelensky has repeatedly stated that America's support accounts for around 30% of Ukraine's defensive capabilities. Losing access to advanced air defense systems, artillery, and critical intelligence could push Ukraine to the brink, making it harder to withstand Russia's continued onslaught on Ukraine. However, the impact of this decision is not confined to Ukraine. It reverberates across Europe, where NATO's unity is already under strain. As Trump continues to prioritize US interests over traditional alliances, European leaders are beginning to question long-term viability of relying on the United States for security. If the US continues down this path, could we be witnessing the end of the West as we know it? The fallout of the Trump-Zelensky showdown forces Europe to confront a critical question. Is it time to rethink its reliance on the United States and forge a new path forward, both in terms of military independence and its place in the global order? As the war in Ukraine continues and the US retreats, Europe may need to adapt, evolve, and rethink how it handles security in the face of changing world order. The implications of Trump's decision go beyond the battlefield. They raise fundamental questions about the future of the transatlantic relationship, the security of Europe, and the very concept of the West Alliance. If Europe is to survive in this new era, it must find a way to reconcile its aspirations for sovereignty with the realities of the unpredictable world, one where the United States may no longer be the dependable ally it once was. As Europe looks to the future, the consequences of the Trump administration's policies on Ukraine may leave lasting scars on the Western alliance. Whether this leads to the end of the West or simply a new chapter remains to be seen. The breakdown in US-Ukraine relations and the growing uncertainty in Euro-US relations mark a pivotal moment in global politics. As the world watches, Europe's response will define its place in the new world order. Will it rise to the challenges, or will it crumble under the weight of the shifting geopolitical landscape? In 2025, tensions between the United States and the European Union reached a boiling point, setting the stage for a fierce trade war that would alter the economic landscape for years to come. Following his re-election, President Donald Trump made good on his earlier threats to impose a 25% tariff on European goods, framing the European Union as an adversary and accusing it for undermining the United States' interests.
Are you going to impose tariff too on the European Union like you are going to do for Mexico and Canada?
Well, you're asking me a question because I'm sure you didn't hear. Am I going to impose tariffs on the European Union? You want the truthful answer, or should I give you a political answer? Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's important to understand Trump's decision wasn't just a strategic move aimed at securing better deals for the United States. It was a calculated power play. By threatening tariffs on European goods, he hoped to shift the economic balance in favor of America, using trade as a lever to disrupt long-standing alliances. Trump's rhetoric painted the European Union as a trade enemy, claiming the European Union was formed to screw the United States. These inflammatory words rattled Europe, pushing the European Union to retaliate. In response, European leaders quickly made it clear that they would not back down. European Union, feeling cornered and threatened, retaliated swiftly, imposed its own tariffs on a wide range of US goods, targeting industries from agriculture to aerospace, in a bid to protect its economic interest and stand firm against what it viewed as unfair aggression from the United States.
This morning, the United States is applying a 25% tariff on imports of steel and aluminum. We deeply regret this measure. Tariffs are taxes. They are bad for business and worse for consumers.
The president of the Renew Europe group summed up the gravity of the situation. We have entered a new epoch. The US has changed alliances. EU's retaliatory tariffs signaled not just an economic response, a rejection of Trump's transactional approach to diplomacy. As the tariffs piled up, the transatlantic relationship began to unravel. The two economic giants were locked in a tit-for-tat conflict, with each side imposing new duties on key industries. Escalation of this trade war wasn't just about goods. It was about trust, power, and the shifting dynamics of global influence. The effects were immediate. European retailers were forced to raise prices, while US manufacturers saw their products become less competitive on the global stage. In both the US and Europe, the economic consequences were felt far beyond the political elite, reaching consumers and business alike. The trade war was more than just an economic battle. It was a stark indication of how Trump's policies were reshaping global trade alliances. By imposing tariffs, the US and EU were not just punishing each other economically. They were driving a wedge into the very fabric of the post-World War II economic order that had long favored open markets and cooperative diplomacy. Just as the US imposed tariffs on European goods, European leaders began questioning their strategic reliance on the United States, especially in terms of defense. The EU, once dependent on American military might, began to explore the possibility of a self-sufficient European defense force. This marked a turning point, with Europe starting to ask, can we continue to rely on the United States for security and economic stability, or is it time to step out on our own? The escalating trade war between the United States and the European Union isn't just an economic issue, it's a geopolitical one. The tariffs and the retaliation that followed have pushed the European Union to reconsider its long-standing alliances and its place in the global order. If this trade war continues to escalate, it could lead to deeper divisions within the West, shaking the foundations of the post-World War II economic and political system. The outcome of this economic conflict remains uncertain. Will the trade war be resolved with diplomacy, or will it lead to an enduring rupture between the United States and Europe? One thing is clear, the US-EU relationship has forever been changed. As both sides brace for the consequences, the question remains, is this the beginning of the end of the West as we know it? French President Macron called for Europe to take its future in its own hands, saying Europe must stand as a sovereign power in its own right. This marked a turning point. Europe began exploring military independence and greater autonomy. Germany, once the heart of the US-European cooperation, echoed this sentiment. Chancellor Friedrich Merz emphasized the need to strengthen Europe's military independence. The very idea of Europe could stand on its own without the US was no longer just hypothetical. Its time had come. He declared, my absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe's independence from the United States. For Germany, the idea of military independence was a radical shift. After decades of American military presence, Europe was now considering a future where it had to defend itself. Not all of Europe embraced this shift. Eastern European nations like Poland and Hungary gravitated closer to Trump's populist and nationalist rhetoric, seeing in it a path toward their own political stability. In contrast, Nordic nations like Sweden and Finland warned that distancing from the US could invite instability and weaken Europe's collective defense. What happens now, with the United States weakened and the Europe no longer relying solely on the US for security? A new question arises. Will NATO endure, or will Europe chart its own course in the world order? The world order, the post-World War II alliance of Europe and the United States, is beginning to fray. European nations are pushing for a greater autonomy, seeking new alliances with powers like China, Russia, and India. The rise of China and its growing influence in Europe signals the beginning of a new geopolitical landscape. Russia, with its growing influence in Ukraine, and China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, sought to assert themselves as global leaders. As the United States retreated, China began to fill the void. Trump's foreign policy, focused on short-term gains, gave Beijing the opportunity to present itself as a stabilizing force in global politics. China's rise as a global power has challenged the post-World War II order, which was long shaped by the United States leadership. Unipolar world America had built was rapidly fragmenting into a multipolar landscape. In his final term, Trump's relationship with Russia, particularly with President Putin, raised eyebrows in Europe, where once America had been the bulwark against Soviet aggression. Now it seemed to align more with Moscow, further alienating Europe. The questions are clear now. Is the end of the West upon us? Is the Transatlantic alliance crumbling? Can Europe stand on its own, or will it return to the United States for leadership? As the world changes, one thing is certain: the future of the West is no longer guaranteed. The question now is whether Europe will set up to redefine its place in the world, or if it will once again look to the US to lead. One thing is certain: Europe's role in the global stage is changing. Whether Europe will evolve into a more self-reliant power or continue to look to the US for leadership remains to be seen. As the US retreats into isolation, question remains: can Europe rebuild its future on its own terms, or will the legacy of the past continue to define its path forward? If you found this video insightful, subscribe to the Knowledge Compass. See you in the next video.